Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Hannibal Barca, Rome's Greatest Enemy, Part 1, Road to Rome. So, this is the first episode in our series on Hannibal Barca by HistoryMarche. A couple weeks ago, I put up a poll asking you guys which Roman history series you wanted to see the most. This one won that poll, and so that's what we'll be doing. But all those other series I listed in the poll, I do want to react to those eventually, so we will get to them all if time permits. I've got a lot of videos to react to, but first, Hannibal. We've done a bit of Hannibal content on this channel, a couple videos by Historia Civilis were about the Second Punic War, and of course we reacted to Oversimplified's videos on the First Punic War, which is very much related to the second one. We saw Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, so that'll provide us with a bit of background for the series we're about to see. But I'm very excited to get into this one to see Hannibal and his exploits. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or channel memberships, through which you can get exclusive reaction content, including reactions to Roman history. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest enemy. That very well could be true. I'm excited to get into this series.
After General Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a Celtic slave, 26-year-old Hannibal was elected as the new Carthaginian commander.
And we had seen from videos on the First Punic War that Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, after fighting in the First Punic War, where Carthage had basically ended up losing, it was a stalemate between the Romans and the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians ended up getting the worst side of the deal. Hamilcar had moved the family to Iberia to sort of build his base of power, expand Carthaginian territory, and he'd done a pretty good job of it. And now we get down to his son, Hannibal.
The young general immediately made plans to invade Rome, but he couldn't begin the campaign before strengthening Carthage's control over the Iberian Peninsula.
Immediately made plans to invade Rome. Now, we know the Barca family beef with Rome, of course, started with Hamilcar, passed down to his son Hannibal. It's remarkable that even at this point, he wanted to invade Rome. I don't know if he always intended to go over the land route, cross over the Alps, but it does also give you some context for the time period we're in. Of course, Rome will eventually be the dominant power of this region, the Western Mediterranean, but at this point, it's very much up in the air. Sure, Rome got the upper hand in the First Punic War, but there was big competition between these two expanding empires, Carthage and Rome, and they are both on the edge of each other's territory and sort of getting close to eating into each other's territory. I mean, this is why the First Punic War happened, and the Second Punic War will basically also spring from this tension.
So Hannibal went to work. He launched two highly successful campaigns in 221 and 220 BC, extending Carthaginian influence beyond the Tagus River.
It's also interesting to see the Carthaginians playing this game of suppressing these local tribes, having to deal with them, expanding their territory. This is very Roman behavior. Of course, it's only Roman behavior because Rome would completely defeat Carthage, and then Rome would take over all this territory. But I often think of Carthage more as a trade empire, so it's pretty interesting to see this sort of activity. But of course, the Barcas, they were not traders, they were warriors. That was true for Hamilcar, and that's absolutely true for Hannibal.
But while on the return route to New Carthage, Hannibal was taken by surprise by a coalition of Iberian tribes. Led by the Carpetani tribe, the Iberians assembled a large army. They blocked Hannibal's path and fortified their position against the Tagus River.
Okay, I'm interested to see this battle because most of my knowledge of Hannibal comes from a little later in his life, crossing the Alps, fighting in the Italian peninsula, sort of his more famous exploits. I don't know much about his time in Iberia.
Then waited for the Carthaginian general to attack. Here, Hannibal showed his military genius for the first time.
Okay.
Instead of attacking the Iberians head-on, he erected his own fortified camp and waited. By day's end, his scouts found a river crossing to the southeast. During the wee hours of the night, Hannibal ordered a small contingent to stay in the camp and keep all campfires burning.
Okay. So, see, this is something that every great general, which Hannibal absolutely is, has to have. They need the ability to look at a situation where there are certain options presented. You could, charge into your enemy, fight them, you could retreat, you could, whatever, and find a third option. They also need this ability of deceit and trickery. This is something that, say, Julius Caesar was very famous for. This is in some ways reminiscent of Caesar, though of course Caesar would come much later. Setting up your camp, performing this act of deceit, pretending like all of your army is still in the camp while you're doing a little bit of a nighttime march. Don't alert the enemy, but we're changing and getting a better position. We are seeing Hannibal's early brilliance that we will see many times throughout this series,
creating the illusion that the whole Carthaginian army was still encamped. Meanwhile, he led his army on a swift flanking maneuver further up the river. By sunrise the next day, Hannibal was behind the Iberian position, feigning retreat towards New Carthage. Thinking that the Carthaginians were retreating, the Iberians rushed to intercept them.
And presumably he's not actually retreating, so the flanking maneuver alone isn't enough. Hannibal also baits his enemy into making the first attack, which presumably he is ready for.
But once they were midstream, Hannibal sprung his trap and unleashed his cavalry. Iberian infantrymen, chest deep in the fast-flowing river, couldn't offer much resistance and were cut down with ease by the Carthaginian cavalry charge.
Look, I'm not sure how formidable of an enemy these Iberian infantrymen were, but that's a pretty impressive maneuver from Hannibal. I'm also curious throughout this series to learn a little bit more about the men who fought under Hannibal, the Carthaginian forces. I know a lot more about the Roman military, how it was composed, how it was organized, the auxiliaries, etc., etc. I don't know nearly as much about the Carthaginians. Of course, I know about their famous elephants. We can see a little elephant marker on screen right now. But I'm curious to learn about their force, particularly Hannibal's men, in a little bit more detail through this series.
Those who managed to cross were trampled by the elephants. By now, the Iberian army lost all cohesion, and the mass of tribal warriors started fleeing. Hannibal ordered his army to pursue them across the river, completely routing the enemy.
Damn, good start.
On the Tagus River, Hannibal had his first major victory, but Rome took notice. Wanting to stop Hannibal's expansion, the Romans made their presence felt. Already allied with the wealthy and powerful city of Saguntum, Rome declared it their protectorate, an act that Hannibal perceived as a violation of the treaty signed by the two great powers in 225 BC.
Interesting. First off, Saguntum, that's a very familiar name. I've certainly heard of that city before. And second off, though, as you can see from this map, Rome doesn't really hold any territory anywhere near Iberia. If you zoom out a little bit and we think about this conflict between Carthage and Rome that I've already mentioned, this is basically a contest for the Western Mediterranean. And so any territory in the vicinity is up for grabs. Rome and Carthage want all of this territory that is currently, I guess you could call it currently neutral or inhabited by smaller tribes or smaller kingdoms. These are the two big empires. And not to mention, they also want each other's territory. Now, since the First Punic War, they haven't directly gone to war because of this peace treaty. They've tried to, I imagine, keep the peace a little bit, but you can always see that tension under the surface. These are two expanding empires. They want the same territory. Eventually, they're going to come into conflict, and we can see it here.
BC, which divided the Iberian Peninsula along the Ebro River into Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence. A sworn enemy of Rome, it didn't take long before Hannibal acted. He marched on Saguntum and besieged the city.
Yeah, look, if you give Hannibal any opportunity to stick it to the Romans, he will absolutely take that opportunity. I mean, there's that story about Hamilcar, Hannibal's father, forcing him to, or not forcing him, but like asking him to swear this oath to destroy Rome at any cost, or whatever. I don't remember the exact story. I also don't know if there's any truth to this story, but it gives you a good idea of, I guess, the hatred that Hannibal had for Rome after what happened to his father in the First Punic War. Hamilcar had that hatred for Rome, and he passed it down to his son.
In 219 BC, the Carthaginian army reached the outskirts of Saguntum. The city was heavily fortified, situated atop steep slopes and cliffs, high above the surrounding plain. Saguntines requested aid from Rome, but the Romans were busy fighting the Illyrians. Nevertheless, with provisions stockpiled, Saguntum was prepared. Besieging it would not be easy. Hannibal installed a blockade around the entire city and placed most of his forces.
This is also sort of something I want to mention. As you can see, Saguntum, a whole city, rather defensible. They have forces to defend it. Just a quick note, I feel like sometimes there's this idea that, you know, we talk about Rome, and then we talk about barbarians or tribal peoples, and there's sometimes this popular idea that we are talking about, you know, tribal peoples who were rather uncomplicated, didn't have complex cities or styles of government, didn't settle in one place for a long time. That's not what we're talking about. I know that's sort of the connotation using the term barbarians or tribal peoples sort of brings to us, but a lot of these tribal peoples were very complicated. They had complicated societies, ways of doing things, cultures, governments, military forces. Now, we don't know a lot of details about many of them. We know more specific details about some of them, particularly the ones that Rome wrote stuff down about. But I feel that is a somewhat common misconception that needs to be corrected. Now, of course, there was a lot of variety amongst these different peoples. I mean, we're talking about Iberia. We're primarily talking about Iberia and Gaul. But this really applies to any of these territories that Carthage and Rome would go on to conquer. There was a wide variety and diversity amongst these different people groups. So I always like to remind people of that, or, try and get people to keep that in mind when we're talking about these groups of people, or these tribal peoples, or whatever you want to call them, who do not have the history books written about them that Carthage or Rome do.
Forces at the western end. Saguntines stubbornly kept pushing every Carthaginian assault back, but the siege went on for months, and the many assaults gradually wore down portions of the wall. Eventually, the defenders had to abandon their outer defenses and form up behind the inner wall. Slowly and relentlessly, Hannibal's army made progress. And after 8 brutal months, the Saguntines made their last stand at the citadel. Soon after, the city fell. Inhabitants that survived the siege were either killed or sold into slavery.
Yep, and I mean, of course, that is unquestionably brutal, tragic, and horrific, but as we covered in, say, Oversimplified's videos on the First Punic War, or as we've seen many times on any reactions we've done on the ancient world, that was pretty typical for the time period. If you fought or besieged a city that didn't surrender, and you defeated it, there would be, first off, mass looting of the city. There would often be massacres, and those civilians who survived would be sold into slavery. Very tragic, but also pretty typical for this era.
After the fall of Saguntum, Rome demanded justice for what they perceived was the violation of the treaty, and claiming that Saguntum was in the Roman sphere of influence according to the treaty.
That's kind of funny, because Hannibal went for Saguntum because he claimed Rome had violated the treaty. This is clearly just two expanding empires who are ready to fight each other, basically. They're already at each other's throats, and any perceived infraction, whether real or not, I'm not sure if either of these actions did actually infringe upon the treaty they signed. Maybe some of you can decide that down below in the comments. But regardless of if there was a true infraction, neither side really cares about that. They just want more control, more power, more territory.
They asked Carthage to hand over Hannibal to Rome so he can be punished. But the Carthaginian Senate stood by their general, and by the end of the year, the Second Punic War began.
All right, here we go. Wow. I'm going to be honest, I know a little bit more about sort of later in the Second Punic War. I mean, all of Hannibal's exploits in the Italian peninsula, the end of the war, than I do about the beginning of the war. And I honestly didn't know that the beginning of the Second Punic War was so influenced by actions that Hannibal took, or at least how he responded to Roman provocations. Obviously, he is probably the main character in this conflict, but I really didn't know that it started from him as well.
Hannibal wintered in New Carthage, preparing for the upcoming campaign. He placed his brother Hasdrubal in charge of Iberia, with 15,000 troops and 21 elephants.
Passing authority around the family, and though this territory in Iberia is absolutely Carthaginian territory, it's also kind of Barca family territory, conquered in part by Hamilcar, and then other members of the family, including Hannibal. Now, it's my understanding that Hannibal was always loyal to the Carthaginian state, and they did have correspondence, and, the Carthaginian government was in control, but they also basically gave the Barca family a free hand to do what they wanted in Iberia, because what they were doing was conquering more territory for the empire. That's good. And so they said, yeah, you know what, just do your thing. So there was a level of autonomy, and this territory in Iberia was, on some level, an independent power base that Hannibal and his father had built up. Though, of course, this is not an unusual arrangement for the time period. I think of, and of course this was a bit later, but I think of, say, Julius Caesar in Gaul. Now, at the time, Caesar still had an okay relationship with the Roman Senate. I mean, he hadn't completely gone against them yet. He was still technically under the control of the Roman state, and though the Senate didn't like him at times, they did basically let him do what he wanted in Gaul. They gave him autonomy and independence to operate how he wanted to, because what he was doing was campaigning and conquering more territory, for the glory of Rome. So it seems like that was a fairly common way to do things, which makes sense when you have far slower lines of communication, far less infrastructure than, of course, you do in the modern world. It probably takes a bit of time to get from Iberia to Carthage or Gaul to Rome. And so you have to give some level of autonomy to whoever's in charge in that province. Caesar, or in this case, Hannibal, and his father, Hamilcar.
Along with a fleet of ships to protect the coastline. To break possible tribal allegiances, around 15,000 Iberian infantry were swapped for 15,000 African infantry, who were more reliable, sending the Iberians to Carthage and Libya to bolster defenses against a possible Roman landing.
Interesting.
And in the spring of 218 BC, with the full support from the Senate, Hannibal marched out of New Carthage with 54,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry.
And part of the reason I give that background on Hannibal's independent base of power is because in these coming episodes, we will see how much Hannibal and his men achieved together, and how much loyalty they have. And I really think a lot of Hannibal's men's loyalty is not necessarily to Carthage, but personal loyalty to Hannibal himself. Like how Caesar's men were loyal to him over the Roman Republic. And of course, Caesar would use that to his advantage. Take it another step, Hannibal doesn't do that. He's still loyal to the Carthaginian state, but I think what motivates his men to continue following him will be that personal loyalty to Hannibal, or Hannibal's family, though I'm sure we'll see a lot of that throughout these videos.
Dividing his army into 3 columns. But beyond the Ebro, tribes allied to Rome were hostile to the Carthaginians, and it took Hannibal about 2 months to pacify the region. He placed around 10,000 troops under the command of Hanno, ordering him to establish a line of defense on the Ebro against possible incursions into Carthaginian territory. With 38,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants left at his disposal, Hannibal crossed the mountains and encamped on the other side of the Pyrenees.
All right.
Meanwhile, the Romans divided their forces. Their plan was to send Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio to intercept Hannibal in Iberia.
I believe the father of the famous and important Scipio Africanus. He will be another key player in this war. I believe that's his dad. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's definitely at least a family member, judging from the fact that they share the name Scipio.
Simultaneously, Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus sailed to Sicily, with the intent of attacking Carthage itself if Scipio managed to stop Hannibal's advance. Additional Roman forces were left to guard the recently conquered Gallic lands in the Po Valley, a region the Romans called CIS Alpine Gall.
Recently conquered. That's pretty remarkable to see. I mean, if you guys are fans of the channel, you'll know that I do a lot of late Republican Roman history and early Empire, right? We're talking Cicero, Caesar, Augustus, this period of time. And so it's pretty remarkable to see an era in Roman history in which Cisalpine Gaul is such a new and fresh territory. Because Cisalpine Gaul will become really one of the central provinces of the empire. Even though it is still Gaul, it's Cisalpine Gaul. What that means is on the near side of the Alps. Transalpine Gaul, that means on the far side of the Alps. You guys can probably work that out from Transalpine. Trans means, like across. Think of transatlantic, across the Atlantic Ocean. So, in the time of Caesar, he will conquer Transalpine Gaul. And that will be this new territory with new allies, new enemies. It's really fascinating to see a time that I'm less familiar with, where Cisalpine Gaul is still sort of unfamiliar to the Romans. And I imagine they, or at least it looks like they don't have complete control over it yet. Really interesting.
Back at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains, Hannibal laid the groundwork for the invasion. Rather than fighting his way towards Rome, he did everything to avoid conflict with the Gallic tribes.
Pretty smart. And, it's remarkable that Hannibal is going straight for Rome, but as they mentioned at the beginning of this video, Hannibal already had the plan to go and conquer Rome. So, he was ready even before the war started.
Mostly paying them for free passage through their territory, promising that his only interest is to fight Rome.
Smart.
Moreover, Carthaginian messengers returning from the Po Valley assured Hannibal that the Gallic tribes there would welcome him, and that they had already began hostilities against Rome in anticipation of his arrival.
Well, would you look at that? I don't know the truth of that, but at least what they're claiming is that, Rome does not have complete control over Cisalpine Gaul or the Po Valley. In fact, there are tribes there who are, or at least would be willing to join up with the Carthaginians against the Romans. Interesting. Also, we see Hannibal sort of paying off these different peoples to let them through. You got to remember at this point, like I've mentioned, there are 2 big dogs in the region, 2 empires, Carthage and Rome. It's not at all clear at this point that Rome will be the winner. And it's absolutely would probably be unbelievable to someone at this point if you told them that not only would Rome win this conflict, but Rome would dominate. Carthage would no longer exist. They would be completely crushed. And so, after that, of course, the tribes in this region are forced to deal with Rome. They can ally with them, negotiate some sort of settlement, or fight against them. But at this point, rewind a little bit, it's not clear that that's how it's going to end up. And so the tribes in this area, they have options. There are 2 big empires. And I am imagining that most of these tribes, these tribal leaders, would rather not fight if they didn't have to. And so even if they are Roman allies, if they can get a sweet deal from Hannibal, maybe he can pay them some cash, they're willing to stay out of it. Not necessarily side with the Carthaginians, but at least stay neutral in this whole conflict, because of this interplay between these two expanding empires.
This was welcome news for Hannibal, because he knew the Po Valley could provide more manpower and act as a staging point for operations into Roman territory.
Yeah, apologies for pausing so much, I was also going to say, Hannibal has already lost a sizable amount of men to garrison the territory he's taken. I wonder if he's going to have an opportunity to refuel, recruit more people, because I think that would be pretty important considering the distance he still has to go.
As Hannibal approached the river Rhone, Scipio's army disembarked at Massalia to resupply, while on their way to Iberia. The Roman general knew that Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, but he wrongly estimated that the Carthaginian general was still far from the Rhone.
Uh-oh.
In truth, Hannibal's army was only 4 days' march away from Massalia. Hannibal rested his army for 3 days in hostile territory and began preparations to cross the Rhone. With the Roman army just 4 days away, Hannibal wanted to avoid a set-piece battle with the Gauls, eager to press on towards the Italian peninsula as soon as possible. But on the opposite riverbank, encamped was the army of the Cavalry's tribe, a Roman ally.
Uh-oh.
They gathered all their boats and built a barrier on the riverbank in preparation to contest the Carthaginian crossing.
That is actually pretty smart. I don't think I've ever heard of that strategy before. Gathering your boats to block a river crossing? Maybe I have. I feel like that might be the first time I've heard that, but now that they've said it, it seems incredibly intuitive. Of course, it only works if you actually have boats, but that's really interesting. And, I mean, it makes sense. You want to cross the river blocking? Just put some boats in the river. Though, I feel the river would have to be a certain level of depth, but you could also just beach the boats, and that would provide some sort of blockade. Maybe the reason I haven't heard of this before is because it's better just to construct some sort of blockade yourself, which I have heard of, instead of using your boats, which may be more valuable for, like sailing and naval combat. Still interesting, though.
But Hannibal devised a cunning plan.
Oh, yeah?
On the third night, under the cover of darkness, he sent a flanking detachment under the command of Hanno, son of Bomilcar. Some 40 kilometers, 25 miles, north.
Once again, we see Hannibal sort of thinking outside the box, developing ways to think around his enemy. And once again, we have a nighttime flanking maneuver which involves crossing a river. I think that's more of a coincidence, but it is funny to see it twice in the same video. But more the message to take away is not that Hannibal loves nighttime river crossings, but, like I said, that he's willing to look for a third option, try and outmaneuver his enemy instead of just taking the obvious route. He's looking for something else.
Hanno crossed the river and rested his troops for 1 day. On the second night after leaving the Carthaginian camp, Hanno's detachment again moved during the night, eventually deploying behind the Cavalry's camp at dawn. The trap was set.
Ooh.
Early next morning, Hanno used smoke to signal Hannibal to start crossing the Rhone. As the Carthaginian vessels were lowered into the massive river, Cavalry's army formed a line on the opposite riverbank. Hannibal was one of the first to cross, to the roars and cheers from his men on the western bank.
Yeah, I mean, we've already talked about how Hannibal thinking outside the box is the mark of a great general. Being able to lead and inspire your men is, of course, another mark of a great general, particularly leading your men from the front. Now, that comes with a massive amount of risk. If you're in the front lines, you're at a much higher chance of being injured or killed. But once your men, who are probably personally loyal to you in particular, see you, their great leader, crossing in the front, that's going to be incredibly inspiring for them. They're going to feel obligated and going to want to follow, to fight for you. You know, we see a lot of great generals throughout history doing this, though you do have to be smart about it. Some leaders lead from the front all the time. Sometimes we can think of maybe like a Napoleon. He was a little more picky. Of course, when the battles got to such a large scale, you can't really lead from the front anyway. But Napoleon was more the type who he knew when he had to step in, give an inspirational speech, make an inspirational charge, and that would cause his men to move forward. So I do think there's a bit of an art to it, because if you're leading from the front every single battle, there is a chance, a very high chance, that you're going to get killed at some point. But this is definitely a skill that we can see with a lot of the greatest generals and leaders throughout history.
As the Carthaginians started disembarking on the eastern riverbank, Hanno sent a part of his force to loot and destroy the Cavara's camp, while he personally led the charge against the Gauls near the river. The Cavaras were stunned by the flanking maneuver, and they began fleeing the field in panic, unable to cope with Hannibal's perfectly synchronized attacks. With the Gauls scattered, the battle was soon over, and the Carthaginians hastily proceeded to cross the river.
Nice. Another victory.
Most of Hannibal's troops crossed the Rhone by the end of the day, while it took another day to get the elephants across the river. While the Carthaginian army gathered on the eastern bank, friendly Gallic messengers from the tribes in the Po Valley arrived, warning Hannibal that a Roman fleet is anchored nearby.
Uh-oh.
Hannibal sent his scouts to locate Scipio's army, and, incredibly, not long after, his Numidian scouts stumbled into a Roman Gallic scouting party.
I have to keep reminding myself, by the way, that this is not Scipio Africanus. This is one of the issues with a lot of history, particularly ancient history. We have a lot of people with the same name. And, you know, when we're looking at, say, French kings, we just give them a number. Louis I, Louis II, Louis III. It's still annoying, but it's a little more clear. Versus here, we've just got like Scipio, 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 and then they're differentiated either by nickname or sometimes just by context. So I have to keep reminding myself, this is not Scipio Africanus. This is, like I said, I believe his father.
Both generals now knew of each other's whereabouts. Scipio quickly moved north to confront Hannibal, but by the time the Romans reached the crossing point a few days later, only an empty Carthaginian camp was left behind.
Damn,
Hannibal
too slow.
had no time to waste. He had to reach the Alps before the winter. But trouble was brewing in Iberia. Scipio placed his brother,
I'm curious. I didn't know Hannibal's approach to the Alps was under so much pressure from the Romans. I mean, the Romans are right there. They're being a little slow. They couldn't quite catch them, but they are ready to strike. So this is a very interesting situation.
Cornelius Scipio Calvus in charge of leading the army into Iberia, while
Another
he headed
Scipio?
back to the Po Valley to assume command of Roman troops there
Ah,
and prepare
okay.
for the Carthaginian invasion.
Okay, interesting. So the Scipios split off. One was sent to Iberia, and one headed back to the Po Valley. That makes sense.
Scipio Calvus, now in charge of the invasion force, disembarked at Emporiae. The Greek trading cities and the Iberian tribes in the region welcomed the Romans. But even prior to the arrival of Roman troops, the Carthaginians began to lose control over the conquered region, as Hanno's force wasn't large enough to conduct offensive operations.
Uh-oh.
What's worse, Hanno only learned about the Roman arrival when Scipio Calvus was well on his way towards the Ebro River.
Yeah, and he is quite a bit outnumbered.
He sent word to Hasdrubal, who began marching north.
Though you can see, even though, he's more... Scipio Calvus has more than 2 times the infantry, the cavalry is of a similar number. And this points to something which we know, which is the Carthaginians at this time had much better cavalry than the Romans did, and the Carthaginians particularly employed the Numidian cavalry, known as some of the best in the world, whereas the Romans would always sort of struggle with cavalry, and they too would use auxiliary forces. like I said, I know a little bit more about the Late Republic. They'd often use Gallic cavalry. But particularly at this point, if you were to put a Carthaginian cavalry force up against a Roman one, I would probably go with the Carthaginian one. I'd say they would have the advantage. And the point I was making is that they almost have the same number of cavalry, even though Scipio has twice the number of men. Clearly, the Carthaginians also have more access to cavalry.
North with 8,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. But instead
or
of
at least value it more.
for Hasdrubal, Hanno marched out with 10,000 troops to meet the 20,000-strong Roman army. Scipio Calvus easily crushed the Carthaginians, killing 6,000 and capturing 2,000 troops, along with Hanno himself.
Killing 6,000, capturing 2,000? Really? From a force of 9,000, you've lost 8,000. That seems a bit exaggerated. Maybe it just was that decisive, but that seems an incredibly high number of casualties. I'm not exactly sure what the source is for that. I know a lot of ancient numbers, particularly in terms of casualties and numbers of men, can be over-exaggerated. I don't mean to point fingers. I don't know if this was. Maybe it's true, but that just seems like an incredibly high percentage loss.
Once Hasdrubal arrived, he didn't have enough troops to meet the Romans in battle, so he launched fast-moving raids along the coast. Carthaginian raiders killed many Roman sailors as they were foraging, reducing the effectiveness of the Roman fleet by half. Nevertheless, Rome now had full control over Iberia, north of the Ebro River. A serious blow to the Carthaginian war effort.
Okay, so this is territory which I talked about earlier, how Carthage and Rome are competing for this territory, even though Rome doesn't actually control territory in or near Iberia. Well, now they do. They literally have a ground force stationed in Iberia. They have a foothold, and, this war has brought that about. You can already see the Roman desire to expand, though, of course, we've got quite a while in the war to go, and it won't go as well for the Romans initially as they might have expected, but we'll get to that part.
Moreover, northern Iberia would become a base of operations for Roman incursions into Carthaginian territory south of the Ebro River.
Though Iberia will be an important theater. Of course, the most important theater of the war, for most of the war, will be the Italian peninsula itself, where we can follow the exploits of Hannibal. But Iberia will be, an important theater, and it's worth keeping an eye on it, checking in periodically. Now, what are the Romans getting up to in Iberia?
Meanwhile, having marched his forces over the Alps, Hannibal would soon turn the Italian peninsula into a war zone, in a campaign that would elevate him to a general of legendary status.
This is very true. All right, and this is the end of part 1. I definitely enjoyed this one. I liked getting some more of the early portion of the Second Punic War, which, like I said, I don't know that much about. My knowledge of the entire Punic War is not super great, but I do know a little bit more as we get further into the conflict. I enjoyed this part, and I'm excited to continue. If you guys enjoyed this, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, plus check out the Patreon and channel memberships for exclusive reaction content. Anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.